Google Maps fails, and how to stay creative in a workaholic world with author Rahaf Harfoush. I'm Joe Bauer, and welcome to another episode of Travel Tomorrow, the podcast, yes, it's a podcast, about what's new and what's next in travel. I'm joined by the always brilliant and utterly amazing, I did not write this, Alicia Underly Nelson, who joins us from Fargo. How's it going, Alicia?
Great.
I see you've worked on your writing skills.
Yes, I was just going to see if you would read it all the way through before you knew what you were reading and started giving me a little attitude about it. And you made it about as far as I thought you would.
Attitude? That does not sound like me. When would I ever give attitude or be snarky or cranky even, as we were just discussing before we hit record?
Anybody that's ever listened to this podcast knows very well that that's your baseline, and we all like you anyway.
I don't know. Can we speak for everybody, though? Does everybody like it? I don't know. I wouldn't be so sure. If we did a poll, I think I'd be disappointed.
Maybe that's a sign that you should attempt to be a little less baseline cranky.
Well, when it's been a constant blanket of gray in Berlin since, I don't know, since I moved here, basically, it's kind of hard to have a different attitude in life. But sure, I'll give it a shot.
It's below zero in Fargo. Get over it. Come on, buck up, kid.
But do you get sun? Do you get sun going on there?
You know what? We do, and that makes all the difference. Right now, it's like gorgeous, blinding white snow.
So don't tell me,
skies,
it's below zero
sun
here, and then admit that the sun makes all the difference, when I just said that the catalyst, if you will, of my crankiness, which, by the way, we differ on the definition of crankiness. If my baseline is what you call cranky, then I feel like I have to have a worse mood for it to be called Joe cranky. But putting that aside for a second, I just said it's gray here, and that's what's making me this way. And you said the sun makes all the difference. So I don't know what I'm getting at.
But Berlin is a great city, right? Like, can't you offset it
with
with fun indoor activities for a few months?
Do not mistake me. Very much love it here. It feels surreal to be here every day, but yeah, the gray does not make one perk up, to say the least.
Marvelous. Can I take us to our first stop?
As long as it's with the train.
No. You're ruining my segue.
How am I ruining your segue? We have a train beepity boppity thing, the sound effect jingle.
We are cutting.
Bippity boppity, yeah.
We are cutting
that's what
this
they call
part
it.
out.
Now
All
we'll
right.
see. It's the magic of me getting to be the editor. I can put all the nonsense in.
No.
Now boarding.
Speaking of Berlin, some car commuters in Berlin got a little bit of a surprise when the traffic jams shown on Google Maps turned out not to be traffic jams at all. Instead, commuters were rerouted by 99 smartphones in a wagon. I love this. Business Insider reported that artist Simon Weckert, who is based in Berlin, pulled the wagon down the city's sometimes empty streets with all the phones using Google Maps simultaneously. And since Google Maps determines traffic patterns based on location data from users, because there were basically phones showing that 99 people were stuck in a traffic jam on an empty street, he gamed the system with nothing but a wagon and 99 phones, and essentially could create traffic jams at will. And he did the experiment this summer, but he published the results earlier this month, just in time for Google Maps' 15th anniversary. The powers that be at Google Maps responded with appreciation, saying that creative uses of the apps would make the maps work better. But that wasn't really what the artist was going for. In a statement, he said there's no such thing as neutral data. This is from an email that he sent to Business Insider, who wrote the story. Data is always collected for a specific purpose by a combination of people, technology, money, commerce, and government. So he had some big things to say about data. So what do you think? Google Maps, useful tool, or is it more trouble than it's worth? Does the artist have a point?
I mean, Google Maps creeps me the hell out, because I can so much as look up directions on the U-Bahn or something. And even if I don't end up taking that route, like 5 minutes later, I'll get a push notification asking me, well, how full was that U-Bahn ride that you took? And it's just like, don't track me. And it's really strange that this is a problem here, because there's such a history, especially with East Berlin and with the Stasi, of having a lot of privacy protections, but sure enough, whenever I look up a transit route, 5 minutes later, Google Maps asks me like, so tell me, how was it? How full was it? And they want more data, and it's terrifyingly creepy to me.
Right. I think that's exactly what the artist is saying. He's saying like there's a certain privilege that goes along with having access, but people just trust these platforms. Like, oh, it's for my own good. It's easy. It's useful for me. Yeah, but like, do we even know what they're doing with that data? And what is the price that we pay for having that access? And I would add, you're in an urban setting where, the future is going to be in very geo-targeted ads and marketing to you every single step of the way, because that's where the population density is. I travel a lot in the American Midwest and Mountain West, where it's more sparsely populated. And there you kind of have the opposite problem, where I think it's really, Google Maps are very useful in urban settings. They're really not in rural settings at all. I've had Google Maps attempt to tell me that I was in Montana when I was still in North Dakota. I've accidentally wandered over the Canadian border because it was not accurate. I've had Google Maps attempt to put me in several bodies of water. So, it's not, if you can map everything, great, at least it's useful, but it's not always useful for all of us either. So you have people in sparsely populated areas giving away their information and then also not being able to use the service. Like, it seems like a weird trade-off to me.
I kind of wonder if the artist used 99 99 phones because of the song 99 Luftballons, the 99 red balloons. You know that song? Remember that song?
I do. I love that song, actually.
Yeah. And what I mean, like 99, like why else would you use 99? Was there any reason he used 99?
I didn't find a reason that he used it. I was looking around his site. He does a lot of this sort of thought-provoking stuff on technology, but he's based in Berlin, so technically you could go over and ask him if you find. I really want to know. I think you should ask him.
Yeah, that's going right on the to-do list. Excuse me, sir, did you use 99 phones as a weird homage to 99 or 99 Luftballons, 99 red balloons?
See, you're being dismissive of it, but if I lived in Berlin, that is like the first thing I would show up and ask. Like that, I don't know, works to my favor sometimes. You got to be the weird reporter with the strange questions. Gets you in the door sometimes.
I'll just stick with the weird that works for me.
I know.
Now boarding.
Today, our guest is author Rahaf Harfoush. She is the author of Hustle and Float, Reclaim Your Creativity, and Thrive in a World Obsessed with Work. I wanted to talk to her because I've realized that I'm quite privileged to live in Germany, which promotes a pretty healthy work-life balance. We get something like 20, depending where you live, 24, 25 federally mandated vacation days. And I understand that sometimes people in the States maybe get 15 days and they consider themselves lucky to have that. And there's statistics out there that show that not everybody's even taking their holidays. So I wanted to talk to her to learn more about how to kind of fight back against this old world work-obsessed culture, to allow all you listeners out there to have more travel experiences in your life. So I started off by asking her a little bit about her work, because in some respects her work is basically about other people working too much. And so I was curious to ask her what impact working too much has on our lives.
This is a bit of a complex issue, so I'm going to kind of break it down into a couple of parts, okay? So the first part is what we know about overwork unequivocally is that if you overwork to the point of exhaustion, if you're pushing yourself beyond your mental and your physical limits, if you're not taking breaks, if you're not sleeping enough, if you're not eating well, if you're not taking the time to exercise, all the things that we know, right? It will result in health issues, in issues that will impact your mental well-being. But from a performance level, it also results in a lower quality of the work that you're trying to do. You're making more mistakes. And I think part of the issue is that people think, oh, if I work an 80-hour week, that I'm going to do double a 40-hour week. And the reality is that's not true. After about, say, 40 hours, sometimes even less if you're doing very highly cognitive work, your performance just tapers off. It's not like you're just doubling the performance, right? So even though it's counterintuitive, the reality is if you want to do more, you actually have to work less. So that's kind of the first part. And then the second part is that we have this very long-standing history with work ethic being considered a very important indicator of your moral goodness, of your value and your worth as a person. And this can be traced back directly to the American dream, right? And the American dream simply says, or the Canadian dream or Australian dream, it exists in every type of economy, but basically it says, if you work hard enough, you will be successful. Now, the problem with this, the challenge in believing this, is that if you do full-heartedly, just like many of us do, believe in this idea that your hard work is always rewarded with success, then what happens is you also believe, whether you realize it or not, that if you're not successful, it must mean that you're not working hard enough. And so we take on this personal responsibility for our own productivity. We say, oh, I need to work harder because I'm not successful. I'm not hustling hard enough. I'm not waking up early enough. And we don't talk about things like wage stagnation, income inequality, automation, all these other things. No, we say it's your fault. You're just not being productive enough in your day. And this propaganda is just totally available on social media, where if you just look around, it's like everyone bragging about how busy they are, how hard they work, as a part of a narrative that says my hard work equals my deservingness of being here. And it's just really sad because what we're learning is that the things that we're doing trying to improve our performance are actually hurting our ability to perform.
So there is certainly a lot of that out there, but we talked a little bit offline about how there's a bit of a rebellion going on against that, against traditional work culture that, you know, values those 80-hour work weeks. Can you talk a little bit about this, the rebellion going on against traditional work culture and the rise of nomadic lifestyles?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different motivations that we're seeing that are fueling the rise of this type of nomadic culture. So one, I think many people don't forget that that our generation, say millennials, we grew up in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis, right? So as we witnessed the erosion of the middle class, we saw an entire generation of people that saw their parents working really hard, right? Their parents working 80 hours, 100-hour weeks, putting in the effort, the late nights, and still lose their jobs and still lose their homes. So the first part is, I think many of us and many people that chose to pursue this lifestyle kind of said, well, wait a minute, the rules that our parents followed in order to get their success, those rules broke down. And so I don't know if I want to put 80 hours in order to have the same level of threat. So that's kind of like the psychological. The second part of it is that there was a big necessity with the financial crisis, with all of the changes that we're seeing happen to many careers. A lot of people were unable to afford a livable wage, rent in major cities, finding jobs that paid them enough that they could survive in these like first tier labor markets. It was just too expensive. We've all seen the horror stories of, 5 roommates sharing a 2-bedroom apartment in New York, and it's costing them thousands and thousands of dollars. So what happened is with the rise of technology, people suddenly started realizing that there's this other option, that not only do we want to say no to the traditional 80-hour work week that deprived us of our mental well-being and also any financial stability, that there's this new opportunity where we could design a different life for ourselves. And so this opportunity enabled people to access like top tier labor markets without paying top tier labor market prices for things like rent and expenses. So it was almost this collision of both opportunity and necessity and a rebellion that had a lot of people saying, hey, I think there is a better way to live my life. I want to see the world. I don't want to work a full-time job and work so hard and only get 10 days of vacation in order to be able to enrich myself in different ways. So all of these factors have created this boom in nomadic lifestyles that we see.
So speaking of seeing more of the world, this is a travel podcast, so I wanted to shift it a little bit more towards travel. Anyhow, how do you think taking more time off for travel could benefit somebody's working life?
I think we live in a culture today where we're constantly chasing these what I call false sense of urgency, right? That email, that text, that notification. So we're constantly in a cycle where we get into a routine where we're responding to the same things in the same way, we're reading the same things online. And that can really limit your exposure to new ideas and new opportunities. I teach innovation and disruptive business models at one of the universities at Sciences Po here in France. And one of the things we talk about is that one of the best things that you could do for yourself is to enrich the input of what you're putting in your brain, the things you're seeing, the people you're interacting with, the places you're visiting. And travel has an incredible ability where it forces you to get out of that comfort zone. It forces you to get out of that routine. And it allows you to see the world with a fresh pair of eyes. You get to meet new people, experience different culture, try new foods. All of these things are enriching experiences, not only to your own personal development, but they also give you the opportunity to just stop and think about some bigger things, right? Some things that maybe your direction in life, a problem you've been facing, a new business idea. How can you have the time to do that when we're running around glued to our phones, in meetings, in phone calls, in conference calls, like trying to respond to all of these notifications and all of the stimulation? Where often you see that entrepreneurs and other people will say, oh, I got that inspiration when I was walking along the beach, when I was hiking, when I was visiting a new city, when I tried this new experience. So it's incredibly powerful for us to constantly push ourselves to experience new things, because it prevents us from getting into that rut, and it prevents us from taking things for granted and making assumptions about how the world is that could blind us to a great product, a great service, a great career, or a great lifestyle choice.
That all sounds great, and I would love to walk along the beach or through the mountains and get some nice ideas, but unfortunately few of us have the luxury to demand a better work-life balance or demand to have work remote opportunities so that we can travel more. So what would you recommend to someone if they do still work in an inflexible, work-focused culture or office environment?
Okay, so this is where I might get in trouble here, because I might say something that's a little controversial, but I think we as workers, we also have to take accountability for our complicity in some of this culture of overwork. And by that I mean, we can sometimes be our own harshest bosses, right? And even when we work in places where, for example, we could technically take 30 minutes to go outside and have lunch outside, we choose not to. We choose to sit at our desks. We choose to work really late. We choose to answer emails late at night or on the weekends. And despite what you might tell me, oh, my boss expects this or my boss expects that, like, I have worked in those types of organizations. I have done it. I have been there. And I know for a fact that every person can find some small minute of time that they can devote to their own rest and their own replenishment, right? So, and I used to work for many companies that were very traditional. You had to come in at a certain time, you had to leave at a certain time, you were expected to constantly be productive. So I'm speaking from experience. And I think we have to take ownership of our time, even if it's something as small as, I'm going to leave my phone, I'm going to tell my colleagues I'm gone for 30 minutes. I'm going to go outside and I'm just going to like sit outside on a bench somewhere and just take a couple of deep breaths. Like that will do more for your mental well-being than a ton of other things. And in terms of travel, I think if you can't get away physically, then you can try to make sure that you're experiencing your city in new ways, make sure that you're trying different types of food, that you're exposing yourself to different cultures. And if you live in a city, there are so many things that are going on all the time that you can kind of transport yourself into that different state of mind. The problem is that we get into this mind frame where we think, well, I can't do that, right? And the psychology behind that, because we think we have to respond to everything right away. We think people are not going to see us as working if we take 30 minutes. Like that's on us. That's on us. And I've worked in all different types of teams. I have worked with large companies and startups. I've worked with other independent entrepreneurs. I've worked with creatives. And I've yet to meet a single person when I have said to them, hey, I'm just going to take 30 minutes and go get something to eat. I'll be back in half an hour. Phone me if you need anything, but otherwise I'm not checking email. I've yet to meet one person that has had a problem with that, including my boss. So I've learned that oftentimes we act as our own limiters. And if you were to say to your colleagues, hey, I'm taking 30 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever of undisturbed time, most of the time they're going to say, okay. And, so there's a responsibility there, because if you can't change your work culture, the only thing you can do is to try to protect yourself as best as you can, and to try to create opportunities for you to recharge, refresh, and gain new experiences in a multitude of different ways.
On that note of taking more personal responsibility for, fighting back against some of the traditional work culture, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, what do you think is the fine line between working too much and not working enough? As I can hear some of the older people thinking that, anybody who's saying to work less, to work more is thinking of somebody being lazy. And I'm sure that's not at all what you're suggesting. But I'm also thinking of people like myself and other people who work in creative industries, I suppose. Like this podcast, for instance, is not my day job. I do it on the side. And I know I can be just as guilty as the next person of really absorbing myself into whether it's this creative project or another thing I'm doing. And I tell myself, like, I'm working more, but I'm doing it because I enjoy it. But then that enjoyment can blur into not enjoying it anymore as I get too obsessed with it. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on how do you recommend people find this fine line between, doing their day job and working on a side hustle or something that they are passionate about and they enjoy doing, but making sure that these two things combined don't take over our lives?
There's two parts. There's two parts of this. The first part is that we have to, all I'm saying is that the current systems that we have in place right now, the way we measure productivity right now, doesn't make sense for creatives. So we're forcing ourselves to adhere to the system that says work long hours nonstop, because that's the ideology that we've inherited from the Industrial Revolution. So I'm not saying be lazy. What I'm saying is, think of your own creativity as the most important tool that you have for your performance. And think about, what would a system that was created to hone that ability, to improve that ability, to nurture that ability look like? Because I'm pretty sure it wouldn't look like an 18-hour day without any breaks, without any stops. So I'm just saying the systems that we've put in place to measure creative labor don't make sense for creative labor. So the way that you look at your performances, you're not saying, oh, how hard am I working? You're just saying, how smart am I working? Am I working with my energy levels? Do I understand the points of the day that I'm most creative? Am I working with my own habits? Am I taking the time to rest periodically because I understand that rest is not a diversion of my goals? Rest is a necessary step for me to maintain my pace so I don't burn out. Am I thinking about how and why of the projects that I'm doing? Like, this is all very easy. This is all stuff that every high performer should do. And it doesn't mean that you're just going to be like not working. It just means that you're going to be working in a way that is tailored for your body, for your brain, and for your creativity. 3 things that we know without a doubt need rest. Now, to answer the second part of your question, because I often have a lot of side projects as well. I'm a writer. I do research. I do consulting. I'm working on a novel right now. And the way I think about it is, you have to balance every creative activity that you do. You're either recovering energy or you're spending energy. So you just have to balance between these two states. So you might work on a podcast, and that's where you're spending energy because you have to concentrate and do all of those things. And then you might take a break afterwards, and you might go for a walk, or you might watch a TV show, or you might take whatever, you might go have a workout, whatever activity you feel is replenishing that reserve. So then you can go and spend it again. And that doesn't mean that you have to stick to 8 hours on and then side hustle, right? Like, the whole idea of 8 hours is it's like nonsense. 8 hours doesn't make any sense. Again, another thing that we borrowed from the Industrial Revolution. So you might get more done, Joe, if you wake up, do your job, whatever your job is, take like a 45-minute break or a 2-hour break, come back, do the second part of your job, take a 2-hour break and rest, and then come back into your podcast. You might find that your energy is much steadier, and that you have the stamina and the vitality to do that, than if you just said, oh, I'm just going to work a 12-hour day, get home exhausted, and immediately try to produce my podcast. So it's just about looking at our energy as a limited resource that you have to constantly invest wisely and constantly replenish. And everyone's activities for replenishment are different. This is why if I'm going to give your listeners one piece of advice, it's to take the time to understand your own creative cycles. I'm a night owl. I do my best work at night. I don't like doing heavy cognitive tasks in the morning. So I've tried to structure my day around that. I know that I can't write for more than 3 hours without being totally like brain dead. So after 3 hours, I will schedule a call. I will go out for a walk. I'll do some emails. I'll do some filing. Like I will specifically schedule time that I can recover before I go into my next deep sprint. And so these are the types of tools that once you figure out your own cycle, you can realize that you can get so much more done because you're working with your body and not against your body, which is what so many of us are doing now.
I like this idea of, spending creative energy and then recovering creative energy. One thing I can already see that would be a problem with me is this is where it's going to sound like I'm like making you my therapist and this is a personal therapy session, but I know I've spoken to other.
What I'm here for. Hit me.
I appreciate that. But I've spoken to other creatives, and this is the thing too with them that, I have it in my head where I'm like, yeah, I'm only going to spend maybe, to use your example, 45 minutes to work on this podcast, and then I'm going to take a break. But what happens, and when my wife inevitably listens to this, she's going to nod her head and is that I'll say, oh, just one more thing, and then I'll do that thing, but then it gives me another thing, and just one more thing. What is the carrot or thing or Pavlov's dog whistle that I need to have to just get me and other people who have this problem as well to just rip myself away from the task and say, that one more thing can wait. I'm going to go take my break now. What's that thing or something that people can do to just finally pull themselves away and take that break?
I mean, that's a really hard one because sometimes you're in the zone and sometimes you're doing really well. Like sometimes I might get to the end of a 3-hour writing period, and if things are going so well, I might push, right? I might push and just do a little bit more. If you're in that state of flow, I get wanting to stick with it, and maybe you should stick with it. What I'm saying is that after you've stuck with it, you have to understand that recovery time has to come from somewhere. That you might have to say, okay, like I'm going to work a little bit more on this, on this podcast, but I know that I'm going to not do my inbox for 45 minutes later. And this is going to be weird, but it so often, because we have been brainwashed by this hustle culture, we don't put value the same way in productive hours that we do recovery hours. So we think if you're not working on anything active, that's a waste of time. But that is just a framework issue. That is just a psychological issue. If you start reframing the way you think about downtime as not downtime, not time when I'm not doing anything, but actually an investment in giving your brain the time to think, the time to pause, the time to reflect, that if that becomes an essential part of your process, then you'll see that it has the most value. And this is the crazy thing, like your brain, when you give it just space and time, not on social media, not on emails, not on text, not on phones, when you're just giving yourself time to think, like going on a walk or washing the dishes or taking a shower, that is when your peak creative brain wakes up and says, hey, we're not distracted by any of these high cognitive tasks right now. So let me think about all the stuff that I've been wanting to think about all day. An idea for a new episode, a solution for that problem I haven't been having. So like for me, I can't tell you to stop working. You have to value that stop time, whether it's by setting an alarm and saying to yourself, okay, like I've been sitting now for 3 hours. I need to at least get up for 10 minutes and stretch because that's good for my body, and then come back and see how I feel. Or whether that's saying I'm going to be realistic about what I can accomplish today and I'm going to prioritize other things, my relationship with my wife, working out, taking time to spend with my family and friends, that those things are going to be equally prioritized. Like that's the only way. If you don't value downtime, then nothing I tell you, no advice I'm going to give you is going to stick, because you're fundamentally not seeing the value in taking that rest. So what I would do is I would flip the question on you and I would say, what is something that you can think about that would add the right value so that you see like why? So let's therapy session this. I'm going to ask you a question. Why should you take a break? Tell me what happens when you don't take a break. Tell me how you feel, and you justify to me why you should be taking a break.
As soon as I was asking the question, I was thinking, I know when I don't take a break, I know like my posture starts to kind of fold over the computer, and I start feeling I don't feel good about myself, and I start to feel like I don't know, like kind of melting into myself. It probably doesn't make any sense, but it's just this weird feeling I get where I just feel like I'm turning into a corpse.
And tell me about the work. Tell me about you working on how does the work how's the work impacted when you're like melting into the seat and not feeling great and your posture is hurting? How does that impact the work?
Not great. Believe it or not, I do not do my best work while feeling like a corpse. I can imagine that when I'm working, what happens is that like I said before, I get this, just one more thing, and I am getting onto a rhythm, and it keeps happening, but then I start to like kind of fold over and become more sedentary and sitting for a long time than I should be, and the ideas start to kind of come slower. The creative process starts to slow down, but then that's when I know that is when I need to take my break and make myself get up. But I know what I've been doing in the past is thinking like, oh wait, no, I was on such a flow. Come on, I can keep it going. And it's kind of like using more gas than is in the tank, I suppose.
Yes. And because we've been taught that we should push through, right? You should push through. You should just keep going. It's this endurance sport. And like, that's all weird propaganda that doesn't actually help you. For me, it's like I start noticing that writing a sentence starts taking me longer and longer and longer, and the words are harder to come by, and I'm not liking what I'm writing, and the writing's getting clunky. And even though I'm making progress, it's actually not good progress, because I've learned over time that I have to undo all of that the following day. So I would actually, next time you should set a hard limit to stop, and then you should leave a little note for yourself about these are the things I really want to tackle, like the first thing when I sit down, or these are the things I kind of want to think about as I step away. But you have to reframe stepping away as a key part of your process, because you just said it, you don't feel good and the work suffers. So if that's the case, then what is it that keeps you there?
Man, this is good therapy. And I'm gonna take that break right when we're done talking. But I just had one last question for you, because this is about travel. We always like to bring it back to travel. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how implementing the various strategies you've implemented in your own life to live a less work-obsessed life, how has that helped you free up your life for more travel opportunities, for more interesting experiences in your life?
So I absolutely love travel. I spend a lot of time traveling, and I was very deliberate. It took me a long time, but I was very deliberate in designing my life in a way that I could do my job from anywhere. Because there was a point in my life when I was traveling for work, but it was like, they're back. Like I wasn't actually seeing anything. And so one of the major changes that I made was to design a work life where I could spend an extra couple of days somewhere to really enjoy it. So I think for me, like the most important thing was understanding that a lot of my attitudes about my work and what I had to do was coming from our history. It's coming from the story we tell ourselves in our society about who gets to be successful. Like I had a lot of work baggage. We all have a lot of work baggage. And my book, Hustle and Float, basically dives into the root causes of why we have this complicated relationship with work and why it forces us to act sometimes against our best interest. And it was only by doing that hard work, and like it gets deep, man. You're talking about therapy. You talk about, I had to go through and face my need, my ego, my need for validation, my need for recognition, the pride that I felt from being busy, the goodness as a person, my self-worth that I felt from my work ethic, like all of those things I had to dismantle. And then once I did that, I started realizing that I could design a way for me to work that honored my energy and my creativity, that still left time for the things that I really loved, which was travel. And once I prioritized that, instead of prioritizing overwork, instead of prioritizing being busy as a badge of honor, instead of prioritizing hustling so for the sake that I could tell people I was hustling, then making a decision and choosing what projects to take or choosing how to live my life, that became a lot easier because I wasn't being manipulated by all of these weird work psychology influences and forces that impact us. So I know it sounds crazy, but before you know that expression, no matter where you go, there you are. It's kind of, I know it's a travel blog, but before you set out into the world, you have to kind of be sure that the person that you're taking, yourself, as you're going out into the world, that you're constantly fighting against these psychologies that are telling you and brainwashing you to not take advantage of all of these opportunities, to not see the world, to not take the time, because we've been taught that if any time that's not spent producing or contributing to our, capitalist society is a waste. And what we're seeing is that travel gives you this enriching opportunities where it makes your life better. And we should be prioritizing how we can make our lives better so that we can work and we can do work that we love without, turning 80 and realizing that we've spent so long hunched over in our desks that we never had the chance to see all of the wonderful things that there are out there.
Well, that's great. You certainly don't need to convince me to get away from my desk and to travel. And I'm really appreciative of your time. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm going to go take a break now.
Great. You should. I will expect you to take a picture of yourself on your couch and post it to Twitter as proof, because I won't believe it until I see it.
Again, that was author Rahaf Harfoush. So, Alicia, what do you think about this idea of encouraging people in the States, since we primarily have a North American audience? What do you think about this idea about encouraging them to fight back against traditional work culture? Do you think it's realistic that people who have perhaps a boss who's working all the time and encouraging their workers to do the same, to actually take a step back and say, no, I'm going to take all my holidays? Do you think it's realistic that we're going to see a cultural shift there?
I think we're moving to a point where we're starting to be more aware of what burnout is, and we're starting to be more aware of how our existing structures benefit employers and not employees. But I don't think that's going to change until we take responsibility for ourselves. I really like that she said that this is our responsibility as workers too, that we can't wait around for these changes to come to us, that we're going to have to advocate for them, and we're going to have to prioritize our own downtime. I've seen that happen in my own life. I used to work a job where we were on call literally 24/7. We would do those 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. Every time we tried to take vacation, we were shamed. We were told many times, we could not go. And my boss would call you right up until you were boarding on a plane. It would just be nonstop. And it wasn't even it was strictly necessary. It was just the way that business operated. And it really took me watching people around me burn out to be like, no, I'm not going to do this. And it was hard. But it's not something that would have just naturally happened for me. So I have a little bit of experience with how to advocate for myself, but I think it helps when you see other people around you also saying, I'm going to take time to rest. I'm going to prioritize that downtime as much as I prioritize productivity, because you can't be productive and you can't be creative, like she said, if you're working nonstop. It's not possible. We're not machines. But until we can look at our own work and kind of prioritize our own sanity, employers aren't going to change that. It's going to have to come from workers ourselves, I think.
You're right. And something I actually just thought of, and this could be a nonsensical thought because most of my thoughts are nonsensical, but I had this thought because, as you know, Alicia, I've been doing this little reading experiment of following the weekly Parsha for the Torah as part of my heritage research. And I came across this idea that it specifies in the Torah that you should pay your workers the same day that they complete their work. And I will connect this to the whole topic besides just paying your workers on time in a second. But I found that interesting because in general, the U.S. is still a pretty religious country. And whether you are religious or not, I feel like a lot of the ideals that come from a religious background still influence a lot of how the country operates. And obviously in the Torah, they have the Sabbath, and there's a whole big importance placed on making sure you take time to rest. But it seems interesting to me that we have a lot of people, especially people who currently run the country, and not trying to equate those with people who read Torah and follow the laws, but you have people who are running the country, and a lot of the country still is quite religious, but they don't operate by these basic principles that if you were to ask them, yeah, of course I follow a lot of the teachings in religious texts, but it doesn't seem they do. And I don't know if this is a relevant thought that I'm vomiting out right now, but it just struck me as interesting that it's still kind of a religious country, and there's a lot of importance placed on the religious text that people say they're following, to rest and to pay your workers the same day and kind of have that healthy work-life balance. I feel like that's, whether the religious aspects aside, I think that's an interesting thing that doesn't seem to have actually made it into our society in the same way other things that people have picked from these books force it into society.
Well, yeah, I think so many religions have that basis where it's about rest. It's about taking time for reflection. It's about creating space, whether it's, a day of rest, like in, the Jewish tradition or the Christian tradition, or taking multiple breaks for prayer and reflection every day, like in Islam, or, you're doing different forms of meditation. Like so many traditions around the world emphasize this. But I think as our culture, as Western culture predominantly gets more fast moving and we emphasize production, like we're not really about that kind of reflection, or we're not about family, or we're not about health. We say that we are, but really all of our actions are showing that companies are supporting more money, more productivity. I was in Spain for my friend's wedding, right around the time that the siesta, which is like a cherished part of Spanish
and
culture.
Rightfully so.
Yeah, and totally sets up the day. I mean, this isn't just like you go home and take a brief nap. It's like you go home, you have a leisurely lunch, you refresh. Like you're taking like hours of time. Well, at the time that my friends got married, we're all sitting around the table and they were like, can you believe it? Like the international companies are doing away with this. Like this is horrifying. This is ridiculous. And I was like, well, I mean, that's a bummer, and I'm going to really miss that. I hope that when I go to Spain, 10, 20 years from now, that there's still that break in the middle of the day, which you need because it's hot and it makes sense for that place. But I'm like, I think that they'll really lose that. But I can see how that is from an international perspective, and I will never forget it. One of the other guests looked over at me and was like, well, the last thing that we want is to work like you. And he's like, I bet you don't even go out for lunch. And it was just like the most horrifying thing he could imagine. And I was like, no. And he's like, where do you eat? I said, well, I just eat at my desk. And the whole table just gasped. They were like, what?
Scandal.
I'm like, well, I know, but I got to get things done. And they're like, but why? Like, what are you really getting done when you're eating a sandwich? And I'm like, that's a good point. Like, and I think that's what, this book is about too. It's like, okay, you can multitask, but like, what are you actually accomplishing? Like so many times, I know this in my own work, I will sit, and I liked that she walked you through when you're struggling and you're not feeling creative, like how does the work feel and how does it look? I teach courses on creativity as well and how to create routines that maximize your creativity. And her research is really in line with, what the books that I've read, the scientific studies that I've seen, and more importantly, or equally importantly, I should say, like practical results from creative people. And that so much of the time we tell ourselves, like, I'm just going to push through this. I'm going to fight through it. I'm going to make it happen. But I found in my own work and in interviewing other people, like, we can sit there and try to hammer this thing out for a half an hour while we're eating a sandwich or Googling something for research or trying to listen to a podcast. Or we could take a minute and eat on a bench for 15 minutes and enjoy the sunshine and come back and the work gets done more quickly. And I think when we try to be productive every single minute of the day, we do kind of run into that gasp-inducing productivity that horrified the people in Spain. Like, yeah, we're working, but like, are we really getting anything done? And is it really helpful for us? Like, we could probably go home and recharge and come back better, right?
Well, jumping off that point of, you said before about accomplishing something or if we're getting anything done, something that seems to permeate, at least in the jobs I've worked in Germany, from Dusseldorf to Berlin, and in conversations with other people who work here, is, we always say the expression, like, I've been in offices in the States where we'll be like, where something will be happening, people will get stressed and be like, well, whatever. It's not like we're curing cancer. But I feel like that mentality has not actually seeped into the workplace in the U.S. the same way that at least in my experience in Germany, it has, where when people say, well, we're not curing cancer, they actually act that way. What I mean is that of course, things can get stressful and, there are deadlines and whatnot, but people don't worry about what they're going to accomplish as if they don't accomplish this, they will not cure cancer. Whereas I feel like the stress I'd experienced in U.S. workplaces, they treat things as if it is as important to complete these tasks as it would be to cure cancer. And that's something that I feel like I've noticed here. And I'd actually be curious, I would have been curious to take this conversation because you mentioned Western culture. I have a good friend of mine worked in Beijing, and there's a great documentary right now, if you haven't seen it, The American Factory, that shows in China they get 5 days off per year. That's it. And I had thought, like, well, they can take whatever. Maybe this is anecdotal, but my friend who had used to live there said that they don't even get to pick the 5 days that they get off. So I think about like how privileged I am to be in Germany compared to the work-life balance I had in the States. But then I think there are other parts of the world. I don't think it's necessarily an East or a Western culture thing. I think it's a global cultural production thing that needs to be, pushed back against, to realize that most of us, unless you are a doctor doing cancer research, most of us are not curing cancer, and that the things we're doing are perhaps not as urgent as we might believe them to be.
That makes so much sense. I worked
thank you. Conversation over.
I'm making the point.
I'm just kidding.
I actually think that it really is so influenced by culture, both, at a micro level and then at a greater cultural level. I worked in the same job where I had a manager that said, it's only radio. We mess it up, nobody dies. And then a few years later, we were taken over by another company that had a very different perspective. And suddenly it was the same job, but suddenly we weren't allowed to take breaks. Suddenly our comings and goings were monitored. Suddenly we needed to be there extra time because everybody was staying 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours later. Suddenly everybody was working holidays and weekends. And I'm glad that you brought up China, because actually I was researching before a trip to Japan how Chinese, Japanese, a number of different cultures approached their work lives, because I thought it was really interesting. And I was actually sitting in Japan and started talking to a guy who was a salesman, and I was a salesperson. And so we sat down and started talking, and we spent the entire night together. That sounds terrible, but our group spent the entire night together chatting.
Not editing that.
Yeah, and the Japanese, I think, have it much worse than Americans, because there is that same culture of like obsessive productivity, but it's also for them, like, it was the same sense of obligation to their management that I had in my job, but it was so much worse. So like if his boss stayed until 4 a.m, they all stayed until 4 a.m. And he looked at me and he said, you don't want to get to this point. You don't want to get like me. You don't want to be inches away from retirement and not be sure you can make it. And that haunted me. That was like the scariest conversation I'd ever had, because here was somebody who was excelling in the way that I was excelling, and somebody that I started the conversation thinking like, wow, like what a role model you can be for me. How are you doing this? How are you like getting over your need for sleep and food? And he was like, no, don't do it. Turn around, get off the train. And it really struck me. And I think about him all the time. I think about that conversation all the time. And
of course you think about him all the time. You spent the night with him.
Hush. My husband was also there, and my brother. That would just be weird.
Thruples are a thing now, too. That's fine. I'm ruining your point. I
apologize.
You
are ruining Continue. My point. But I do think
I can only be earnest for a finite amount of time.
I know. But I do think that that's something that we can all learn from. Like, we can think about the ways that we want our lives to change and change them little by little. Tell other people. Because honestly, like, I don't think I wouldn't have talked about my own struggles if he wouldn't have told me. So conversations like this, the conversations that we're having now, matter. And I think anybody can find those little ways to make their work-life balance a little bit more sustainable, because it doesn't make any sense, I don't think, to wait to travel, to wait to explore, to wait to live the life that you want to live when you're retired, because like statistically, not all of us will make it there. That is a fact. Like, we might as well enjoy the life that we have now.
So the lesson is to find that work-life balance so you can, like Alicia, go to Japan for a sexual throuple adventure.
Precisely. You're terrible.
Yeah, well. I need some levity. It gets too earnest and my body starts to quiver.
Oh, well, that's what I'm in your life for.
Well, we've talked about work culture around the world, but you have a postcard from your neck of the woods.
I do indeed. On February 8th, the Star Tribune reported that a traveler to Minneapolis was pulled out of the Mississippi River with a mild case of hypothermia. he reportedly stated that Google Maps, there it is again, instructed him to cross the frozen river to get to his hotel. The article shows Minneapolis Fire Department spokesman Brian Tyner stating that he assumed the gentleman misunderstood the instructions to cross the Stone Arch Bridge, which is literally like right there. And
it is. I know what you're talking about.
And not the semi-frozen river in the middle of winter. It should be noted that this happened right after bar closed, so there may have been an alcohol and or fatigue element to it. But again, people, Google Maps, it is just a tool. It should not override your senses. As I stated earlier, I have also had Google Maps tell me I was supposed to turn into a river. But you know what? I did not do it because it's a river. Use your skills, folks. Come on.
I think you're giving people too much credit. If they're going to walk, I don't care how drunk they are, if they're going to walk into a river in Minneapolis in the winter, I don't think they have many skills going for them.
Oh, it makes me alarmed. People that are going to make that mistake really should not be trusted with Google Maps at all. It just fills me with terror. Come on, people. Oh, how did people get around before? Were they just walking into rivers all on their own? It's stunning to me. I
do give Google Maps some credit because it has, as I'm sure it has, and this would actually be an interesting episode for us to do, I think. It's given, I've spoken to women who have traveled by themselves who say it makes them feel more comfortable because they'll go outside of, maybe the neighborhood and feel comfortable to know that they can get back to someplace safe if they needed to. And even for myself, I use Google Maps quite a bit to go outside of when I'm traveling different places, to go outside of the zone that is like near my hotel that I could, quickly remember the streets and get back to. I'll go far away and know that I can just open my phone and go back. I just won't walk into a river and get hypothermia.
Yeah, it's a tool. Use it when it seems logical, and then when it tells you to do something dumb that can kill you, you're like, no, thank you. Next.
Don't be a tool. Google Maps is just a tool. There you go. And that's our show. Thanks as always for tuning in. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do us a favor, do us a solid, rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts.
And you can follow us on social media. We want to hear what you want to hear about next, what you thought about this episode, and any of your thoughts in general. We're at TravelTomPod on Twitter, TravelTomorrowPod on Facebook, TravelTomorrowPod@gmail.com. If you want to drop us a line. And we want to thank the Fiddle Revolt for their fabulous theme music. Please be sure to subscribe to Travel Tomorrow wherever you get your podcasts.
Do it. Google Maps commands you to.